The Legend of Zelda series has been around for a very long time, longer than most people playing it now have been alive. It's crazy to think that a series this old has been able to maintain such a high level of quality this whole time. While it feels like everything is almost guaranteed to take a huge nosedive after a while, Zelda seems to be one of the very few exceptions that has consistently delivered great products with no real sign of falling off. There have been ups and downs of course, but generally, I think all of us can agree that Zelda fans have been spoiled compared to a lot of other franchises. It's also expected for a series that has been around for this long to have changed and evolved a lot in that time, and that it absolutely did. I'm lucky enough to have been around for almost all of its life, and I've seen that evolution with my own two eyes. I've seen it go from a small passion project to the gaming juggernaut it is now today. For this reason, I thought it'd be interesting to look back on this evolution and give the historical context on each entry to understand why some games were made, what each of them brought to the series, and what the overall reception of the players was at the time. To represent this evolution, and also just for the fun of it, I will divide the series into what I believe to be its different eras between when it began back in the 80s all the way to now, which is 2024, the release of this video. While I will discuss the different gameplay features and narrative points of these games, I will not go into the deepest of details about them. The reason is because I don't want to spoil too much of this series in this video in case you, watching the video, haven't played some of these games yet. I think the series is well worth experiencing in its entirety, and I still want you guys to have a reason to play these games. I will cover what I think is relevant to the series' evolution, so there are going to be some light spoilers, but I will do my best and avoid anything major. Alright, let's get right into it. These are the different eras of Zelda. A full series retrospective. The first of this series' era is one I will call the Era of Chaos. The reason for this name is self-evident. The series was just beginning and it wasn't clear in which direction it was going to go into yet. And it all started with the very first game in the series, released in 1986 for the Nintendo Entertainment System, simply titled The Legend of Zelda. Zelda 1, as I'll be calling it for the rest of this video, was nothing short of revolutionary for its time. It was a completely open overworld, which had never been done in video games before. A lot of it was left to the discretion of the player on how they wanted to approach its challenges, having many possible routes one could take to beat it. And it was even the very first video game in history to have a save feature. Before that, games were mostly level-based and players would have to enter a code to get back to where they were. What Zelda 1 did for the series was lay out the foundation of what a Zelda game should be, or what we should expect to see, and this foundation still holds true in the modern games of the series. We have a world we can explore with full of secrets to find, a series of dungeons that need to be conquered with puzzles to solve, enemies to fight, and a boss to defeat at the end, objects, also known as items, to help us conquer these challenges, and a story to help us understand why we're doing what we're doing. The Zelda series is famous not only for its gameplay but also for its stories and lore, and Zelda 1 introduced us to the main elements of this universe. We are situated in a land known as Hyrule, which is a fantasy land inspired from the medieval ages, with swords, castles, fairies, dragons, and magic. We are introduced to our three most important characters, being Link, the character we control, Zelda, the Princess of Hyrule, and Ganon, our main antagonist. We're also introduced to the Triforce, the most important mythical relic of the series, which will be a centerpiece of many of its narratives. Overall, The Legend of Zelda was a really ambitious game and took the gaming world by storm back in the day. It was the first completely non-linear game of its kind. Even today, a lot of modern games took some inspiration from it one way or another. It clearly shows its age nowadays, and its ideas have definitely been improved on since its release, but back then, it was nothing short of amazing, and was a more than solid start for the series. It was like going platinum with your first album. So, how did Nintendo follow up such a monumental achievement in gaming? Well, by making Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, a game that is nothing at all like its predecessor. If you were to show both Zelda 1 and 2 to anyone who has never played a Zelda game, they might not even believe that they're in the same franchise. Yeah, Zelda 2 is the reason why I'm calling this era the era of chaos. Nintendo was probably just trying out ideas to see what would stick, and a lot of ideas that originated here were kept for a while in the series, like the magic meter, items now unlocking whole parts of the overworld, jumping, which we shouldn't forget about, and even its side-scrolling elements for some of the 2D games. But also, a lot of it wasn't. The RPG elements never came back, this style of combat also never did, and no game has ever been this difficult in the series ever again. The one thing it did keep from its predecessor was the requirements to finish the game, which was beating the different dungeons and their bosses. What it did not keep, however, was the almost completely open nature of the first game. Zelda 2 was fully linear, requiring to defeat the dungeons, or at least enter them, in a very specific order, which kinda goes against what was revolutionary with the first game at the time. It also didn't contribute much to the lore of the series. The most important thing it did was establish why the series is titled The Legend of Zelda, which is not negligible, but nothing that would be too important for future games. Also, while Zelda 1 focused on two pieces of the Triforce, being the Triforce of Wisdom and Power, Zelda 2 introduces the third piece, the Triforce of Courage. I say this is less impactful because, well, it's called the Triforce, implying that there was a third piece from the start. But the piece did first appear in this game though, which I think is still important to recognize. Despite what I said, and this might be hard to believe nowadays, but back in 1988 when it was released, Zelda 2 wasn't received badly at all. People definitely said it wasn't as good as the previous game, but nobody truly thought it was awful. Over time though, it developed the reputation of black sheep of the series, and now, it just seems like everyone hates it for how different the gameplay is compared to the rest of the series. If you don't like it, I definitely can't blame you, but I think it's also important to acknowledge what it brought to the series and how it contributed to its evolution, which is more than what people give it credit for nowadays. But all that was to be pardoned because in 1991, Nintendo would achieve a massive step in the Zelda legacy with the release of, for the Super Nintendo, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. At this point, and now with the experience of Zelda 2, Nintendo probably figured, what if we took everything that made the first game great, expand on every single one of those things exponentially, and add the best ideas from the second one? And yeah, that's exactly what they did. The Super Nintendo had a tendency to do exactly that, take games on the previous console that were successful, and just make them better in every way. We had Super Metroid, another timeless classic, Super Mario World, though that one is debatable if it's better than Mario 3, but there was no debate about A Link to the Past. It was simply an improved version of Zelda 1. The world was bigger and better, now with a light and dark world. The number of dungeons went from a pretty high 9 in Zelda 1 to a staggering 12, a number still only matched once ever to this day. Movement was improved, items were used better now with real puzzles that went beyond block pushing and map studying, combat was more fun with more enemy types, bosses were more challenging, dungeons had more gameplay variety, which is crazy considering that there were more of them, and it even made significant strides in terms of story and lore for the series. We had more backstory on the Triforce, Ganon, the main antagonist, was given an origin saying that he used to be human. We even have his full human name, Ganondorf Dragmire, which to my knowledge is the only time his last name was ever mentioned. We were also introduced to the most iconic weapon of the series here, the Master Sword, the Blade of Evil's Bane, which would become our protagonist Link's signature weapon for almost every game after this one. I could keep going on and on about A Link to the Past, but you get the idea. It's one of the most legendary games ever made. Even today, a lot of people who grew up with it still say that it's the best game in the series despite being over 30 years old, and honestly, it aged really well with time. That said, I think it's also important to notice how different it was compared to the first game, because while it might have taken heavy inspiration from it, it did modify its formula slightly. The most glaring one is that it was a hybrid between an open game and a linear one. For one, the world wasn't fully open, as one half of it was locked behind the first act. The dungeons in said first act also had to be completed in order. A small detail I noticed though, I don't know if it was meant on purpose, but the first act in the light world was presented as open, just telling you that you need the 3 pendants, but the dungeons that kept those pendants had to be done in order. Once you reach the dark world for the second act, the dungeons were presented with a specific order, but a lot of them could be done in whatever order you wanted. I just thought it was something interesting to talk about. In this regard, it clearly took some inspiration from Zelda 2 in a way, and created this hybrid style of progression, which would become the standard for a lot of the following games. This is the point where the series was really taking its shape, solidifying its ideas as to what it wanted to be and forging its identity. It was an adventure game series focused on world exploration, puzzle solving, conquering dungeons, and defeating epic bosses. It had a story for those interested in following it, which despite not being front and center, was definitely not bad, but you didn't have to necessarily follow it closely to understand what you needed to do. It wasn't intrusive in any way, but was there for the people interested. If I didn't make it clear, A Link to the Past was one of the most important games in the series, and one of the most important video games, period. At this point, the series knew what it was all about, and it's with this latest game that we are shifting from the era of chaos, and we are now stepping into a new era, which I will call the era of prosperity. This era is when the series really took off as being one of the best available on the market. As we will see, every game after A Link to the Past managed to separate itself from the others of the series, and showed that Zelda was not just about its now more easily defined gameplay, but also about pushing boundaries and not being afraid to try new things. And the very next title, released in 1993 for the original Game Boy, was a prime example of that. I now welcome you to the amazing world of The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. What did this game do to differentiate itself from the others so far? One very simple thing: its tone. This may sound strange to hear, but when thinking about it, it definitely makes sense. The Game Boy was clearly a less powerful system than the Super Nintendo. While it may be a portable console, it was in black and white, was limited to 8-bit graphics instead of 16-bit, and only used 2 buttons instead of 6. Obviously, you're never going to top A Link to the Past's gameplay when being so limited by the technology you're using, and the developers were smart enough to understand that. Instead, they went for a different type of experience. For one, the game doesn't even take place in Hyrule. Ganon, the Triforce, the Master Sword, and even Zelda, the titular character of the series, do not make a single appearance in the game. They are referenced, but they do not make a real appearance. Instead, we are stranded on the island of Koholint after a shipwreck, which is a very strange but still very captivating place. Everything feels out of place here. Nothing seems to make sense, and some of the things the people of Koholint say are just so random. This is definitely the first game in the series that you are missing out if you're not reading every piece of dialogue you come across. Link's Awakening is hilarious. It will surprise you at every corner, and you can do so many things that you can't do anywhere else. The most known one I think is being able to rob items from the shop, and this results in not only the game asking you if you feel proud of yourself, but also everyone calling you thief in all caps for the rest of the game. You're just invited to try stuff out, and if for some reason you can't proceed through the next area until you do a certain thing, you'll be blocked in the most original way. However, there is a reason why this island is the way it is, and why everything seems so out of place. I won't say why in this video, as I strongly encourage anyone who has never played this game to do so. If you're interested, there's a very solid remake of it on the Switch. I do have a soft spot for the original or its DX version, however, as I think the charm of it works better in that style, but I won't deny that the remake is definitely the better game out of the two on paper, and is probably the version most people should play. They made several improvements on the annoyances the gameplay of the original could have at times. Since the hardware limitations were so big, it inevitably led to, I would say, less good gameplay overall compared to the prior game. The dungeons, while not bad, weren't necessarily that great either on average. The bosses were also complete pushovers. Item variety was lower mainly due to the lack of mechanics like magic. It was also a completely linear game, but I think it works better that way. Link's Awakening was definitely a story-focused game, the very first one in the series too, and a linear style works better for a game like that. It didn't contribute anything to the lore at all, however, but that's fine because it wasn't trying to. It meant to give a unique experience from the previous games, and that it definitely did. The soundtrack was also surprisingly competent for a Game Boy game. Not every song was amazing, but it definitely had its highlights. This was also the first game to give out a name in-game and a unique musical track to each of its dungeons, which would be the standard for the series from this point on. We also got other ideas that would become staples of the series for quite a while, like a trading quest, collectibles, and even different songs you could learn on your instrument. Link always had an instrument to find in the previous games, but it was mainly used to fast travel around the world or to get past one obstacle in Zelda 2. This time though, we had different songs with different effects, which is also something we would see again for a while. For a smaller game made for the Game Boy, Link's Awakening was truly memorable and stuck with you once you finished it. It is still one of the most charming and unique games in the series to this day, and showed that the series was capable of giving strong narratives on top of its great gameplay. But 5 years later, in 1998, the entire world would never be the same. This next game was the game to end all games. If I made it sound like Zelda 1 or A Link to the Past changed gaming forever, let me tell you something. They don't even hold a candle to what this next game did. It is still the highest rated game on Metacritic to this day. You guys all know which game I'm talking about too. Released for the Nintendo 64, say it with me, The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. The day this game was released, the world went completely nuts. It was without a doubt the best video game on the market at this point. It introduced several new mechanics that many games today still emulate, like its targeting system to focus on each enemy, which no game had ever done prior to that. Not only is it the first 3D game in the series, which is already a massive step on its own, it managed to translate everything A Link to the Past offered into that space. The dungeons were just as good if not better, and we can do some of them in different orders again. The light and dark world concept still applied, except with a child and adult version of it. The items are awesome, side content has been expanded on with now even more optional items, longer and better side quests, plenty of upgrades, plenty of songs to learn. Again, I can keep going and going. Not only did it manage to do all of that, it was at the same time a story-focused game, giving even more lore on the Triforce, introducing plenty of new races, showing Ganondorf in his human form, and telling one of the best and most iconic narratives in the series. Normally, you would expect a game focusing on everything at once to miss the mark somewhere, but no, Ocarina of Time really did do it all, and it did it great. It's definitely one of the games in the early 3D era that aged the best. I even personally know people who played it for the first time fairly recently and still thought it was a solid game, but back then, it was really the first Zelda that when you finished it, you just had to drop the controller, look at the sky and think, wow, that was epic. Even today, it's still so many people's favorite, not just Zelda game, but game in general. The only thing you could maybe say about it is that it had a lower quantity of dungeons than A Link to the Past, but seeing how much more it offered outside of that, it wasn't even close to being a problem. Really, I could say so much more about this game, but I think most people have already heard it all by now. It's OOT, this game is legendary. It's almost guaranteed that even if you've never played a Zelda game, you know about it if you're a gamer. It'd be like not knowing who the New York Yankees are and claiming you're a sports fan, or not knowing who the Beatles are and saying you like music. Ocarina of Time is often discussed today as a contender for greatest game of all time, and it absolutely deserves to be in that discussion. Zelda was now cemented as one of the most prestigious and most important franchises in gaming history, and it was in major part thanks to this game. So far, we've seen that when the Zelda series produces a masterpiece, it tends to go in a completely different direction with the following release: Zelda 2 after Zelda 1, Link's Awakening after A Link to the Past. So what was going to happen after Ocarina of Time? Well, the trend continued. In the year 2000, we would see the release of one of the most unique games ever made. A game that, just like Zelda 2, also had the title of Black Sheep in the series for the longest time. Released on the Nintendo 64 as the second 3D entry in the series, it was called The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. Let me give you the context first and foremost for this game. It was made in about a year, reused several assets from Ocarina of Time like character models, was centered around a Groundhog Day style 3-day cycle with a timer in which the only way to save your game was to return to the first day and restart your cycle. If you let the whole timer go through, the moon would crash into the world, resulting in a game over and a loss of all progress you made in that cycle. It also forced you to play its first cycle as a bubble-shooting plant, didn't take place in Hyrule again, had only 4 dungeons, by far the lowest in the series at that point, which was a big deal because dungeons are one of the most defining features of Zelda's identity, and was one of the very few games that required the separate expansion pack to be played. It also had the very minor task of following up the biggest game of all time at that point. It should have been a total disaster, and for most people at the time, it was. Not many people liked the game at first, many despised it even. However, over the years, people started giving it another try and eventually realized that Majora's Mask was secretly a game just as good as its predecessor. The first mistake people did was to assume it could or should be played like Ocarina of Time, which was clearly not the case. Well, you could, I guess, but you would be missing out on a lot of what it has to offer, as this was the first game in the series to have about as much focus on side content as on the main quest. The problem is, since a lot of that side content was based on the aforementioned 3-day cycle loop, it obviously takes some time to understand what you're supposed to be doing. You needed to explore based on trial and error and try to figure out the schedule of everyone in Clocktown, which is the main town of this game. There's a real possibility that you could fail some of these side quests at some point and would have to start them all over again. This understandably didn't make everybody happy. I don't think a single person likes having to restart something, not because you messed up, but because the game decided that you were too late. It's frustrating, but at the same time, it's something that can feel extremely satisfying to pull off once you've learned everything you need to do and finally manage to pull it all off. These moments is when the game starts to click and when you get the full enjoyment out of it. The thing is, all of what's related to this 3-day cycle almost solely applies to side content with 2 exceptions. If you're not someone who cares too much about side quests, then there's significantly less interesting stuff for you here. Like I said earlier, there are only 4 dungeons instead of the more standard average of 9 at that point in the series. However, where sometimes a game with a lot less dungeons has a good chance of featuring a bad one, all of Majora's Mask's dungeons were at the very least pretty good. The last one, Stone Tower Temple, is often seen in people's top 5 best of all time. There also definitely were more build up to each of them, featuring some gameplay centered around the 3 transformation masks, which allowed you to play as either a Deku, a Goron, or a Zora, but not all of it was great. The eggs collecting and beneath the well were definitely stains on the overall adventure that would punish people not expecting them really hard. That said, if you choose to engage with its side content, Majora's Mask is one of the most immersive and most interesting games you can play. Its 3-day loop feature is something that has never been done again in any game ever as far as I know. Some other games are centered around the time loop, but none truly did what Majora's Mask did. Nowadays, it has a fairly small fan base compared to some of the other games in the series, but the people who like it truly love it with a passion. It is the definition of a cult classic. The next game, or games should I say, were released a year later in 2001 on the Game Boy Color, and are some of the most forgotten games in the franchise. These two, who were developed by Capcom by the way, were titled The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Seasons, and Oracle of Ages. There are so many misconceptions surrounding these games. Even this year, I met people who believed that they were basically the same game with minor changes, similar to Pokemon Red and Blue. I can't really say I blame them for thinking that though. The 2 Oracle games were released on the same day and came in red and blue boxes. However, this was just bad marketing from Nintendo's side, as this is absolutely not the case. They each have their own dungeons, bosses, world, story, items, and gameplay features. Seasons featured the ability to change the seasons, and affecting the overworld by doing so, and Ages featured the ability to go back in time hundreds of years, giving another take on the light and dark world from A Link to the Past, where some of the actions you could take in the past would affect the present. Even their general tone were on the opposite end of the spectrum. One of them was more lighthearted and fast-paced, and the other was a lot more serious and somber. Not to mention way more story-heavy. There's a bit of overlap here and there, mainly with some of the items and collectibles, and the reused assets from Link's Awakening, but that's pretty much where it ends. The similarities between the 2 games are pretty comparable to the 2 N64 ones we discussed previously. Why were they released on the same day then? That is because each one gave you a code when finishing it that you could then enter in the other game to unlock the real ending of the whole adventure. You could play them in any order, and there were interesting cameos from one game to another depending on the order you played them in. You could also transfer some of the collectibles you found in one game to the other, and some content, like the most powerful sword in the game, was only available by doing so. Even without that feature, they were still excellent games on their own. They pretty much nailed everything, from dungeons to items to world, etc. They definitely upheld the standard of quality the series offered at the time. I'd say that in terms of puzzle solving, they're both the hardest games in the series by quite a margin. Without exaggeration, these games have 3D level of quality puzzles in 2D games. If you think you're good at puzzles, I recommend trying out the Hero's Cave in Ages from a linked save file. Good luck with that. Overall, these games were really solid, but since 3D games were starting to become all the rage at that point in the industry, I can see it being a bit hard for people to go back to 2D games. We even got a sneak peek a year prior during the Nintendo Space World event, giving us an idea of what was to be expected for the future of 3D Zelda on their next home console, the GameCube, along with Pokemon, Mario, and Metroid. Not only that, but they were released at the end of their console's life, not even a month before the launch of its successor, the Game Boy Advance, so most people instead preferred to wait and just skip them. They were also not the most welcoming games in the series with their difficulty. Along with Majora's Mask, I personally wouldn't recommend them first if you're new to Zelda, but they offered a great challenge for veterans seeking it. With how legendary a game like A Link to the Past was, there was no way it was going to stay on the Super Nintendo forever. At that point, a significant group of younger people had potentially missed the opportunity to play it, as it was now 10 years old. This is why in 2002, they re-released it for their now most recent portable console, and as a bonus, it included a brand new mode to play. This mode was actually an entirely new game, and it was titled The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords. What did this game do different than the others? It provided the chance to share the adventure with up to 3 friends. In other words, multiplayer. However, the ideas sounded better on paper than in practice. Since the Game Boy Advance was portable, it required everyone to have a copy of the game and link cables to connect every console together, which was something that even back then almost nobody had. It was an absolute hassle to play, and the biggest issue is it didn't even have a single player option. You had to find a way to play it with others to play it at all, which means almost nobody did. After being stuck on the Game Boy Advance for way too long, a port called the Anniversary Edition, which is where the footage you're seeing right now is from, who came with a single player option among other things, was available to be downloaded for free on the DSi and later on the 3DS, but only for a limited time, and was never seen again since, meaning that most people never got a proper chance to experience this game. The Anniversary Edition is still one of the most requested re-releases in the whole franchise. Nowadays, the Game Boy Advance version has been properly re-released on the Switch, which didn't have the single player option, but you can still play with people online, making the whole thing a lot more accessible. I also think that because of this re-release, most of the people who desperately wished to play it realized that they weren't missing out on too much for all these years. The game is extremely short and easy to complete, lasting around an hour to finish, and it didn't really feature that much of what made the series what it is. There were no proper dungeons, only levels with a beginning and an end, and they weren't what many of us would call peak game design. There was also no overworld to explore, and anything you found during a level, you would lose going to the next one. At the same time, it was only an add-on to a re-release of a game, so it clearly wasn't meant to be anything too big. For that reason, I think it's not the end of the world. It wasn't trying to redefine the series, it was only there to provide some additional mode for the people who wanted to try something different, and that was completely fine. So, remember that Space World 2000 demo I mentioned earlier? Turns out, it was a pretty big deal. People could not wait to see the release of the next 3D Zelda game. We were going to see a proper sequel to Ocarina of Time, the best game ever at that point. After all, the sequel we got in 2000 was not really what we expected or wanted, and there were only 2D Game Boy games released outside of that. The demo ended up being pretty faithful to the games we got during the new console's early years. We got Luigi's Mansion pretty much at launch, Metroid Prime was released a year later, And we got Pokemon Colosseum and later XD Gale of Darkness in the following years. So, what happened with Zelda? Well, in 2002 we ended up getting a game called The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, and it looked like this. To put it mildly, this was not what people were expecting. At all. People blasted Nintendo for this game because of its graphics and art style. Just like it might be hard to see how Zelda 2 was not despised at the time it was released, it is equally difficult to understand how The Wind Waker was hated back then without the proper context, as it is one of the most praised Zelda games nowadays, especially by those who played the remake on the Wii U. With the proper context though, I think it's understandable. People were expecting something similar to that 2000 demo, and it felt like they just got scammed. I even know people around my age today who told me they didn't play The Wind Waker at the time specifically because of the art style. It's funny how the tables have turned because nowadays, people praise the game specifically for its art style. Even when talking about the GameCube version, it definitely aged much better than the more realistic looking games of the time who were destined to look terrible one day. Art style tangent aside, how was the actual game? Well, to most people who played it, it was incredible. The Wind Waker clearly was a flawed game, which is something I'm sure even its most die-hard fans would agree with. We all know about the Triforce Quest, but what it did great? It did amazing. The game was about traveling on a boat across a vast ocean to explore its many islands. I think that for the time, the most impressive thing about it was the complete lack of loading screens when going from island to island. Of course, with hindsight, the sea was clearly designed to hide the limitations of the GameCube, which is why traveling was generally pretty slow. That said, there was just something about the feeling of hopping on a boat, sailing into the unknown, and soaking the spirit of adventure that was really hard to match, especially aided by that wonderful music that played during those moments. Keep in mind that games with a world this vast were not really a thing at the time. Combat was also better than ever, with Link now doing new acrobatic moves in the form of parry attacks, which were highly effective and even required for some parts of the game. However, the biggest contribution this game brought to the franchise was undeniably its focus on story and expansion of the series' lore, even more so than any previous game, and myself, along with many others, still think that this story is the best the series has ever produced. Link was also way more expressive than he had ever been, thanks in part to the art style. Previously, Link had been a silent protagonist, which is something that is still the case today, but this decision was made so he could be a projection of the player. It was meant for people to feel like they were playing their own adventure instead of experiencing someone else's, like you would when watching a movie. This is where Link's name comes from. He was meant to be a link between the player and the game and be a representation of you. Technical limitations aside, this is why we never had Link say any words, either via text or voice acting, or make that many facial expressions up to this point. This Link though feels a lot more like his own character. He may still not say anything directly via text or voice acting, but he is brimming with personality, to the point where it really feels like you're not really playing your own adventure, but rather experiencing Link's journey as he becomes the hero of Winds. These changes would have a gigantic impact on the direction the series would go from this point on. For this reason, I believe that The Wind Waker marks the end of the era of prosperity and the beginning of a new era, which I will officially dub the Era of Light and Dark. The art style might not have been the only thing that alienated some players, as there was a clear shift in the game's structure compared to previous entries, a shift in soul if you will. For one, even with the most story-focused games so far, it wouldn't come up too often while you were playing. You would have some games be split in two after a certain point, like how A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time were split between Light and Dark World parts for the former and Child and Adult parts for the latter. Some random minor events would happen here and there upon completing a certain dungeon in other games, like Bow Wow getting kidnapped in Link's Awakening, or the Rolling Ridge opening up in Oracle of Ages, which didn't really have anything to do with the story, but would mean you could now reach certain parts of the world you couldn't before. The biggest outlier was probably confronting Queen Ambi after the 6th dungeon in Ages, but this was definitely not the norm. Generally, the story would be present, yes, but the gameplay was what was front and center for the most part. The Wind Waker changed that completely. The story would now be one of the defining aspects of the series starting from here. There was something related to it before and after every dungeon. You also could not, under any circumstance, do any dungeon out of order primarily because of that. It was an entirely linear game, and its events had to happen in a very specific sequence to make it work. Take this part for example. When you reach Great Fish Isle, the island is already destroyed and you are told that you are too late. The real reason why that happened is because it was content cut from the game, but the in-game explanation is because you took too long doing the previous 2 dungeons before getting here. Moments like these wouldn't work in a more open game. The beginning was also much longer than previous entries, having extended tutorials on how to fight and just generally more cutscenes. Couple that with the fairly slow travel speed of the boat and sections of the game that were clearly padding, this resulted in a game that was much slower paced compared to previous entries. What pretty much any game prior offered that the Wind Waker struggled with was replayability. There was a reason to replay every single one of these games in the 2 previous era. Whether it be doing dungeons in a different order, finding every possible secret, seeing different versions of the same story, even 4 Swords had randomized levels so that the returning players wouldn't get bored. There was potentially something new to experience with every playthrough. Majora's Mask didn't even require you to create a new save file to replay any part of the game. Since everything would reset to day 1 every time, you could just play any part of the game at any point. This newest entry, however, was a much harder one to justify replaying due to its longer length, slower pace, and moments of padding. As a reference, my recorded playthrough of Ocarina of Time took me around 8 hours and a half, and I had 19 hearts out of 20 and collected half of the golden Skulltulas. My recorded playthrough of the Wind Waker took me around 15 hours, and I had 14 hearts out of 20 and was missing several treasure charts. Of course, I'll be the first to say it, I know Ocarina of Time much better as a game, but still, that's a major difference and makes the Wind Waker much more of a commitment to get back to. I probably make it sound bad when I say it like that, but in reality, it wasn't better or worse, it was simply different. Instead of going for a shorter experience you can play over and over, the Wind Waker aims to give you an absolutely stellar first playthrough that will stick with you for a really long time. A Link to the Past may make you want to replay it right away when you're done, but the Wind Waker has a finale that has the potential to make any grown man shed a tear. Nowadays, people have warmed up to it, and the hate is almost completely gone. It's also at the top of many people's favorite Zelda games, and it's not hard to see why. It's one of the most important and pivotal games in the series. Quite the opposite of the next game, I shall say. This one was released in 2004, also for the Nintendo GameCube, and was called The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures. Imagine if 4 Swords was given the A Link to the Past treatment Zelda 1 got. That's the best way I can describe this game. In all honesty though, I have a hard time trying to explain why this game even exists. The reality is, nobody asked for this, and it shows. It is by far the lowest selling game in the franchise, being the only one who sold under 1 million copies, which might seem fine normally, but for Zelda, this was a monumental failure. Now add to that it was a Four Swords game with a single player option this time, and still nobody bought it. There's not much to say about this entry really, it's Four Swords but with better levels and mechanics, and about 10 times as long. It doesn't really do anything new for the series besides giving Link a roll attack I guess, and is also extremely expensive to play multiplayer nowadays. Every player required their own Game Boy Advance and Link cable, which just like the previous Four Swords, is something that nobody had back then. I know that the people who got to play this game with 4 players really liked it, and good for them. I was only able to experience it one time ever with only one other player, and I didn't think it made that much of a difference. The game itself wasn't bad to play at all though, even with just one player. It definitely had some creative levels, but it was just unimpressive, and therefore a pretty forgettable entry. The next year though, we would see Capcom, who did a great job with the Oracle games, return to give us, for the Game Boy Advance, The Legend of Zelda, The Minish Cap. This game is beloved by many Zelda fans. It's a lot of people's favorite 2D entry in the series. Just like I explained earlier, by this point, the 2D games coming out weren't as popular or waited on as the 3D ones, which makes sense. Most games coming out at the time were 3D after all, not just by Nintendo, but pretty much every other major publisher. The 2D Zelda games were more or less seen as a way to make people wait for the next 3D entry, and the sales of these games definitely showed that. Part of me thinks this vision was now shared by both the fanbase and the developers. I'm definitely not trying to imply that the Minish Cap is a bad game, far from it. It was a pretty solid entry into the series that, like I said seconds ago, is a lot of people's favorite 2D one, so that should speak for itself. The Minish Cap definitely followed into the footsteps of the Wind Waker though. With the last 2 entries and now this one being completely linear, this was now the new norm for Zelda. We've clearly moved on from the varied and replayable gameplay focused entries of the previous eras, and the series was now about giving more linear narrative focused experiences. As far as the Minish Cap's contribution to the series' lore, we are now once again not focusing on Ganondorf for this one, but on the second most recurring antagonist of the series, Vaati. He was the main villain of the 2 Four Swords game, and the Minish Cap was a continuation of that storyline, showing us his origin. At the time of this video, however, this would be Vaati's final appearance in the series. In terms of gameplay, the Minish Cap did not do much to evolve the series almost at all. At first glance, it seemed like it did, which is why I believe so many people praise it. In reality though, it took a lot of ideas from Four Swords. These included remote bombs, chargeable arrows, even the ability to shrink, which is a core part of the Minish Cap's gameplay, were all ideas that originated in the first multiplayer entry 3 years before. Not only that, its visual style, which is also something that a lot of people praise, is also pretty much one-to-one with it. The only real innovation in terms of gameplay is the Kinstone mechanic. Kinstones were a new form of collectible found in many different places. Each one belonged to a different color and shape, and plenty of NPCs all over the world had the other halves of these different Kinstones. Fusing them together would open up secrets all over the world for the player to find. This new mechanic was something that people either didn't mind or outright hated. The biggest criticism the system got was that it felt unnecessary. It would probably feel much better to have all the secrets already opened and not bother with finding the correct NPCs to open. There was also the possibility that you didn't have a proper Kinstone on you when trying to fuse with someone, meaning more backtracking was necessary on top of the backtracking required to check the newly opened secret. This was definitely a valid point, but keep in mind that this was a much smaller game mainly due to the Game Boy Advance's limitations compared to the GameCube. If every secret was available right away, you would clear through all of them in absolutely no time. The Kinstones, just like the Great Sea from the Wind Waker, were ways to hide the limitations of their system. Despite how small it was though, this version of Hyrule absolutely made up for it in sheer density. There were so many little things to find everywhere in this game, especially in Hyrule Town, which was one of the best and most memorable towns this series had ever seen at this point. There were also hidden sword skills you could learn, but those were all techniques Link naturally knew in previous games, which felt a bit disappointing. It felt like you were just going back to how you were in previous games and not really becoming stronger. In the end, despite Minish Cap not really pushing the evolution of the series forward in meaningful ways, it was still an enjoyable game and a beloved one by the people who played it. At that point, despite the games again not being bad at all, the series was entering a sort of slump. The GameCube failed to meet expectations, the games weren't selling that well for various reasons, and things generally weren't looking so good for the series. That said, Nintendo knew that they were potentially sitting on a goldmine. Remember that Space World 2000 demo? Yeah, it turns out a lot of people were still waiting on that Ocarina of Time sequel. And in 2006, Nintendo would finally give the fanbase what they've been wanting for all these years. It was not only on the GameCube, but also a launch title for its successor, the Wii. And it was called The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. This game was epic. Everyone wanted to play it as soon as it was revealed. To put you into context, this was the reaction to the reveal trailer of the game. Yeah, I wasn't kidding. People really wanted their realistic sequel to Ocarina of Time back then. Twilight Princess dethroned Ocarina of Time as the highest selling game in the series when it launched, which we all thought was impossible at the time. But did it live up to the hype? Did it deliver on the expectations? The answer is, oh yeah, absolutely. Everything you would expect from a sequel to Ocarina of Time, it would deliver. It had a big world to ride around in on a horse, lots of really good dungeons, really original items that were used fantastically within those dungeons, cool and epic looking bosses, even more combat options, and, as the tradition was in this era, a very involved story that would continuously unfold over the course of the game, full of twists and turns, centered around one of the top fan favorite characters in the series, Midna. The game was even more story focused than any other entry we've seen so far. More cutscenes with an even better presentation, even more stuff to do in between each dungeon, an intro segment that made the Wind Waker's intro feel non-existent in comparison, and so on. As another point of reference, my Twilight Princess playthrough took me almost 20 hours, and I was nowhere near 100% completion. The story wasn't just an element of the game that was given more love compared to the others, it was pretty much 50% of the experience here. This is not to say that the gameplay was lacking in any way, of course. As I previously stated, all of the important elements of a Zelda game were very well made. This resulted in a game that is also a ton of people's favorite in the series today. From what I've noticed, it is most other Zelda YouTubers' favorite Zelda game, especially if they were a kid or a teenager back in the mid-2000s, and it's not that difficult to understand why. I've basically stated all of the reasons already. Now, despite all of the positives you can state about Twilight Princess, and by no means am I trying to downplay them, I have to put on my series evolution analyzing glasses for a second and ask the question, how did Twilight Princess evolve the series? Its biggest contribution, I would say, is, without any surprise, to its storytelling. This is the first game with actual character development as part of its main narrative themes, which was not common at all in the series by that point. Previously, as far as important characters that undergo meaningful development, we had Tattle the fairy from Majora's Mask, Kamali from the Wind Waker, King Daphnis also from the Wind Waker, and that's probably it? Compared to that, just from Twilight Princess, there's Colin and the previously mentioned Minna, who are the two obvious examples. There's Zant, who is one of the main villains of the game. Even minor characters like Gorkoron the Elder and Prince Rallis of the Zoras get some development. This is definitely Twilight Princess's greatest addition to the series, and it would pave the way for even more great characters in future games. When it comes to gameplay though, unfortunately, pretty much nothing new is added. This leads me to explain why I decided to dub this era the Era of Light and Dark. Even though for the most part these were quality games, and it is interesting to see how story-driven the series has become at that point, it felt like most of the new gameplay elements were not that well received by the majority of players. Sailing was criticized for being too slow and boring, multiplayer was something nobody really wanted again, the Kinstones felt pretty unnecessary, and now Twilight Princess simply didn't have anything new. There was the wolf gameplay, but that was pretty much equivalent to one of the 3 transformations in Majora's Mask. The Twilight covering the world was also very similar to the Dark World idea from A Link to the Past. The hidden skills, though they did give some new moves this time, were technically first featured in the Minish Cap, and 2 of them were recycled versions of the parry attacks from the Wind Waker. There were new and interesting items, sure, but no real new gameplay mechanic. If you really want to get into it, Twilight Princess even took away some of the most established ones at that point in the 3D games, like the magic meter and the musical instrument, meaning that most of the rewards for exploring the world were inevitably reduced to rupees and heart pieces instead of possible songs and spells, which isn't too compelling. For these reasons, the general opinion on the game over time ended up more mixed, but it's not like it could go any higher than how it was at the time of its release. Back then though, nobody cared about any of the things I mentioned regarding gameplay. I'll even admit, including me. It was what we were all waiting for all along. A realistic looking Zelda focused on giving us the best version of the essentials of what made the series great up until that point. The art style was really the key here, and contributes a lot to the game's identity. Do you think any other game would have caused that big of a reaction back in 2004? Absolutely not. To this day, Nintendo never made a Zelda game with that art style again, helping cementing the game's identity even more. Nowadays, Twilight Princess has pretty much become the poster child of what people would describe as classic Zelda. Even when I think about the series, it's the game, or at least one of the very first games that comes up in my mind. Even with the little things I said, Twilight Princess was without question a really fun game to play, and one I would recommend playing first if you're new to the series. It absolutely is one of the most iconic games in the franchise. After some struggles with the last few entries, Zelda was officially back. A great sage once said,
"You ever have everything you ever wanted, and then when you finally have it, you're like, now what?"
So far, we've seen that when one of the most impactful games in the series gets released, the next one goes in a completely different direction. And yeah, that's what happened. In 2007, Nintendo would release on the successor to the Game Boy Advance, the Nintendo DS, The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass, and 2 years later, they would release also for the DS, the follow-up, The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks. I don't usually like grouping 2 games together like this, as I think even the most similar games in the series have their own identity, but since a lot of what they contributed to the series is so similar, most of what I have to say about Phantom Hourglass also applies to Spirit Tracks, so I will group them together and specify which one I'm talking about when I have to. I've also already done it for the Oracle games, so I guess I'm already a sinner in my eyes, so might as well keep going. On the same note, when I use the term the DS games or the DS Zelda games from this point on, I mean both Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks. These two games' reception has been pretty mixed by the fans. Despite this, along with being a 2D game, Phantom Hourglass still sold an impressive number of copies, which was probably in major part due to the previous game's success. I know there's a minor debate going on about if the DS games are 2D or 3D, which goes beyond the scope of this video, but because the DS is a portable system, because they're clearly lower budget than a proper 3D game, because they have a top-down view, and just for simplicity's sake, I consider them 2D games. During the mid-2000s, Nintendo was experimenting with new control schemes for their games and consoles. The Wii version of Twilight Princess required the use of motion controls for things like aiming and swinging your sword instead of using regular buttons, which was customary for most of the games on that system, and it worked surprisingly well for the time. The DS was also a console that required an unorthodox control scheme, needing to use the stylus on its touchscreen, which was the bottom one to play. This wasn't true for all of its library, but it was for the vast majority of them, and both the DS Zelda games were no exception. The controls, while not being perceived as ideal by most of the Zelda fanbase, still worked pretty well. I would even go as far as to say they worked even better for using some of the items like the boomerang, which you could draw a full path for. The DS games also took advantage of some other new features of the system, mainly the fact that it has a microphone. You are sometimes required to speak or blow into the mic for different puzzles or using certain items. It was pretty cool for Phantom Hourglass, but Spirit Tracks took it definitely too far, with its worst offender being the flute. This instrument requires you to blow into the mic so much that it can legitimately cause dizziness. The sensitivity and quality of the microphone also varied depending on which hardware you're playing the game on, which did not help at all. Beyond the debatable control scheme, the games had really good elements to them. Here we can truly see the influence Twilight Princess had on the series already, as they both feature some great characters with plenty of development. The most known of them is Linebeck from Phantom Hourglass, who is definitely one of the best characters in the series. But others like Sela, Oshus from the same game, and Zelda, Byrne, and Angine from Spirit Tracks are also fantastic. The writing of these games is also top-notch. Zelda games usually have some good writing, but these games were just incredible even for Zelda. The dialogue was absolutely masterful, and they featured some genuinely hilarious moments not seen in the series since all the way back to Link's Awakening. This scene in particular from Spirit Tracks just cracks me up every time. Their narrative and lore might not be as great or interesting as some of the previous entries, but they definitely made up for it with their shining cast of characters. When it comes to gameplay though, outside of the controls, it was pretty much what you would expect. Phantom Hourglass was centered around an ocean like the Wind Waker was, while Spirit Tracks was centered around traveling its world on a train. Which, by the way, a lot of people thought the game was fake when it was announced based on that. It seemed too ridiculous that Nintendo would make a Zelda game about riding a train, but it was definitely real. Anyway, the DS game's biggest innovation was featuring a central dungeon that you would have to return to multiple times during your playthrough. Phantom Hourglass had the Temple of the Ocean King, and Spirit Tracks had the Tower of Spirits. They both worked very differently, so I'll briefly talk about each one. The Temple of the Ocean King was a dungeon with multiple floors that you visit 6 times during the game, which can be shortened to 5 if you know what you're doing. The catch was that the whole dungeon would reset once you left the place, meaning you had to redo everything when returning. Shortcuts for each floor became available with every item you acquired throughout the game, and a warp point became available halfway through, but you still had to go through the same floors of the same dungeon multiple times during the game. This is coupled with the fact that you were on a timer when you were in there. When the time expires, you started taking damage over time until you died. The Temple of the Ocean King has garnered quite the reputation among the fanbase, with a lot of people dubbing it the unquestionable worst dungeon in the series. The intended goal here was to have players take notes on their map to remember what to do on each floor, and also note down the possible shortcuts they could take to speed everything up. Along with moving Link around, the touch controls of the DS allowed you to write down anything you wanted on your maps, and the dungeon wanted to take full advantage of that feature. In practice, however, it didn't work for most players, as most of them didn't think about doing it from the start. The main reason for this, I believe, is because in every other instance taking notes would be useful, Phantom Hourglass told you almost directly that you should. This was not the case for the Temple of the Ocean King, however. There was only this one skeleton you read once and probably forget about in the next few minutes because this guy shows up and steals the show. For this reason, it was a pretty terrible experience for most players, including me when I first played the game, but taking notes makes a gigantic difference, and makes me feel like the dungeon is a bit overhated now. The Tower of Spirits did things differently, making the players go through a different set of floors with each visit instead of the same ones. It severely nerfed the concept of writing stuff down on your map, but Spirit Tracks in general cut down on a lot of the necessities of doing so compared to Phantom Hourglass, with less puzzles centered around activating switches in a specific order, replacing that with using the microphone more frequently instead, and, much more importantly, drawing paths for a partner character to follow. Still, not everyone was too fond of the idea of having to come back to the same dungeon over and over again, which is definitely understandable, especially since the train travel in general was pretty unremarkable, but at least it offered something different with each visit. What it offered though were, I think, some of the best puzzles the series had seen since the Oracle games. They were creative, challenging, and if controlling your partner's movement by drawing their path isn't something you mind doing, the Tower of Spirits was the best content Spirit Tracks had to offer. There were other minor elements from the DS games, such as finding different treasures as collectibles, which was something that first appeared in the Wind Waker with its spoils, but it wasn't taken advantage of that well back then, and neither was it in these games, though they would become pretty important for some of the future games. Overall, while these games were not bad by any means, they also weren't really impactful to the whole series' evolution, and were pretty forgotten by a good chunk of the fanbase. At this point in time, there was a sentiment brewing within the general gaming landscape that Zelda games were essentially all the same. That if you've played one, you've pretty much played all of them. This thought already existed before, but they usually came from the Call of Duty fans, so they could be very quickly dismissed. However, this time it was even starting to come from the longtime Zelda fans themselves. You can probably also feel it with the way this retrospective has been going with the last few entries. I seem to have less and less interesting stuff to talk about with these latest releases. The Zelda formula, as it was known, which was the gameplay loop of explore world, get to dungeon, find item within the dungeon, defeat boss, collect reward, repeat in a strictly linear fashion, was starting to feel a little old for a lot of people. Ever since the Wind Waker, the new gameplay ideas seemed to fall flat and felt more like gimmicks than something actually meaningful for most players. Some of them, like the train, made it seem like Nintendo were running out of ideas, and what really kept the fans of these games around for the most part were the stories that were told. The thing is, not everyone cares about the story of the games they play, or at least not everyone thinks it should be the most important thing about a game. Back during the era of prosperity, a very common saying was, "You don't play Zelda for the story." This seems absolutely insane nowadays, especially to the players who got into the series during this current era, but it truly was a thought that most fans of these games had. Though I do think that the statement was exaggerated, as the stories told were generally good, some great even, but for the most part, they came second after gameplay. In the era of Light and Dark, we saw it clearly shift, where the story would be considered on equal footing with gameplay, which made the latter feel kinda stale to a lot of people. All of this would reach its absolute climax in the next entry. Released in 2011 for the Nintendo Wii, it was called The Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword. By now, I think you can expect what I'm going to say about it. It was an entry that was extremely divisive. Both the loyal fans of that time and the haters of the series got exactly what they wanted to either love or complain about. It was heavily story focused, even more so than the previous entries. Not being a movie quite yet, but we're getting there. And what was advertised as the new gameplay features seemed like cheap gimmicks with very little depth to them instead of truly interesting ideas. I mentioned the motion controls that were on the Wii version of Twilight Princess. Well, Skyward Sword expanded on those big time. They were improved on via the Wii Motion Plus, which was an accessory that you plugged on the Wiimote to allow for better motions and not rely on the sensor bar. This technology would be used to swing your sword in very specific directions and with more precision, which would become a key feature of the game's combat. Those were extremely polarizing at the time. What made things even worse was that during a presentation in 2011 where the series' director Shigeru Miyamoto showcased the upcoming game, he had every trouble in the world to make the controls work, and the presentation went horribly. I remember someone saying back then, "I didn't laugh at him, I laughed with him," and then laughed really hardly at him when I saw he wasn't pretending, which I think sums up the general reaction to it perfectly. In the final product though, while not necessarily ideal, the controls worked fine. It's pretty obvious that the technology wasn't fully there yet, as they can be a bit wonky at times, but I still think it's impressive that they managed to work as well as they did. The only time where they can feel like an inconvenience, to me at least, were during swimming and flying on your left wing, and more specifically when trying to go downwards, as trying to only move your wrist to point the Wiimote down is something that humans physically cannot do. You needed to move your entire arm to make it work. Speaking of flying around, this was the other major gameplay element advertised before the release of the game. And just like the boat from the Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass, as well as the train from Spirit Tracks, it felt like it was just a way to visually replace our horse Epona simply for the sake of it and nothing more. The sky itself was definitely lacking in content. There were a couple notable sky islands with meaningful stuff on them, but most of it was fairly empty. What's a bit sad about this is that the focus being on those two elements, which were probably the worst things about the gameplay, prevented people from talking about its more interesting and new elements, and Skyward Sword had plenty of those. This is the very first game with a stamina meter, and while it wasn't something that players liked very much at the time, it's a mechanic that would be kept in future games. Also, for the first time in series history, you can upgrade your items with some of the treasures you found in the world. Finally, even though flying in the sky might be a bit bland, the Loftwings themselves, the giant birds you fly on, were pretty cool and well integrated into the game's world building. Speaking of, I think it's time we got into what the most appreciated part of the game was by its fans, being the story and most importantly, its lore. Compared to every other game since the Wind Waker, Skyward Sword does an excellent job at expanding the lore of the series by explaining where it all began. This is the origin story of the series, detailing why we keep seeing Link, Zelda, and Ganon across so many of these games. If you're watching this and are unfamiliar with the series, first of all, thank you so much for getting this far into the video, and second, you probably noticed that in all of the games I've covered so far, Link and Zelda seem different every time, and that's because they are. They're descendants and reincarnations of their previous iterations, which we all just took for granted back then without asking too many questions about it. But Skyward Sword tells us the tale of why it keeps happening and how it all began. Without question, this is the greatest contribution this game has brought to the series, and it more than deserves the praise it gets for it. We also get to see how things were before people lived on the surface and where they used to live, which was on a sky island named Skyloft, which is one of the most memorable places in series history. The dialogue was again expertly written, and the characters were also awesome. Groose in particular stands out as one of the most memorable characters the series has ever seen. This emphasis on storytelling though resulted in a game that was as linear as it could possibly be, represented by one of the most controversial parts of the game, Fi. Most Zelda games have companion characters in them, and they're usually there to inform you about what you need to do next or give you information relevant to what you're currently doing. Sometimes these can feel pretty intrusive, the biggest offenders being Navi from Ocarina of Time and Eslo from the Minish Cap. Fi was basically both of them at once, and people despised her. She would often comment on the most obvious of things, like how your health was low, which is something you can clearly see yourself. She would repeat instructions you had just read, and she would even break the fourth wall by telling you that your Wiimote batteries were low. Not only that, every time she had something to tell you, which was pretty often, you would hear that sound constantly until you checked on her to know what she had to say. Basically, she was there to make sure that players wouldn't get lost at any point and knew where to go at all times, aided by her dowsing ability, which allowed you to visually track your objectives and point you in which direction you needed to go. In previous games, you were expected to find these objectives on your own by exploring the new areas, but now, there was basically no need for exploration anymore. You could know where to go at any time. I've already touched on how empty the sky was, but even below the clouds, there was a clear lack of possible exploration compared to previous installments, which was unprecedented because it's a core part of the series' appeal. It's the one reason why Zelda was created to begin with. Shigeru Miyamoto has said that what inspired him to create the series was exploring the surrounding of his neighborhood as a child, and that gave him the idea to make a game about exactly that, exploring. If you don't consider the multiplayer entries, Skyward Sword was the furthest the series had ever been from that idea since its debut in 1986. Right from the beginning, you can see that you start with 6 hearts instead of 5, meaning that there were potentially 12 heart pieces that were not placed anywhere in the world, but just given to you instead. Most of the interesting optional stuff to find in the game was found in Skyloft and Skyloft alone. The surface world had almost nothing interesting outside of treasures, which were not that great anyway. All of this made for a game that was highly appreciated by fans of story-based games, but alienated a huge portion of longtime Zelda fans. It was as divisive as it could get, where most people either loved it or hated it. The average among players at the time definitely seemed to be on the more negative side though. Even if the dungeon lineup was definitely one of the better ones the series had seen, since the world you had to traverse to get to them was so uninteresting, and since the general pacing of the game was so slow and constantly interrupted by Fi, it made for a very polarizing game all things considered. A lot of these complaints were addressed in the HD version of the game, which is the version I would recommend playing for the ones who never did. I would assume that a lot of people who played that version first might have had a hard time understanding why the original had such a questionable reputation, and hopefully I was able to explain it well. Going back to the question I asked earlier,
Now what?
Nintendo would have to find the answer now, because if they didn't, the series might enter its first real slump. They also didn't have anything to rely on that people had desired for a long time. They had used that card already. Skyward Sword ended up selling even lower than the Wind Waker, which, let's remind ourselves, didn't perform up to expectations. No matter what it was clear to Nintendo now, something had to change. A couple of years after Skyward Sword, Nintendo were planning to release a modernized remake of A Link to the Past. Today, the series has seen its fair share of remakes, but at that point, only one of them existed, which was Ocarina of Time 3D for their now most recent portable console, the Nintendo 3DS. However, at some point during production, they decided to make a new game out of this project instead. We can safely assume it was a late decision in development, as the game would end up sharing a significant number of similarities to the 1991 game. The most notable one was using the same overworld map. It wasn't completely identical, but similar enough to say that it was the same. I think they took this opportunity to try new ideas in a familiar setting. The game was released in 2013 for the 3DS and was titled The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds. If I can credit Nintendo for one thing, it is that they definitely listened to the fanbase's feedback, because they went in a completely different direction than where the series was at that point. Let's remember what the biggest criticisms of Skyward Sword were and see how they were addressed. The first one was the motion controls, and yeah, for the first time in 7 years, since the GameCube version of Twilight Princess, we were back to using the B button to swing a sword. The second one was the lack of exploration, and since it reused a previous map in which the exploration was great, that problem kinda fixed itself naturally. The last one was the very excessive hand-holding and linearity, which were starting to feel a bit out of hand. This is where the new ideas for the game came in, and these ideas would change the series forever. Remember how back in the day the possibility of doing dungeons out of order was something interesting about the games and gave them replayability? Well, A Link Between Worlds would push the concept even further, and made it a core part of its design. The overall structure of the game was very similar, doing 3 dungeons, getting the Master Sword, climbing Hyrule Castle, accessing the Dark World, then another series of 7 dungeons before doing the final one and finishing the game. The Dark World was technically replaced with Lorule in this game, which is basically the same if you're being pragmatic about it, though it's the side of the map that got the highest number of changes between both games. In A Link Between Worlds, outside of the first, the fourth, and the last dungeon, you could do anything in the order you wanted. There was almost no linearity to it at all outside of a few exceptions. To accomplish this, the items that were usually found inside those dungeons were now available in a shop in the middle of the world. You had the option to buy the item, but also rent it for much cheaper. However, if you died with an item that was rented, you would lose it and have to get it again, which wasn't the case if you bought it. This was a big deal. It was pretty common for Zelda games to have some items found in the overworld, but those were usually either optional ones, upgrades, or something to let you access certain parts of the world that were unavailable without it. Every item that was used either for combat, puzzle solving, or both was almost always found in a dungeon. This was the norm since the very first game, but now they were available to you from the get-go, which resulted in a world that was back to being completely open, or at least very close to it. This was some level of freedom that was not seen in many years, again, not since the very first game. The concept of the stamina bar was also adapted to items. Essentially, it cost some meter to use them, which would recharge pretty quickly over time. It was probably intended to make sure people wouldn't find themselves without any ammo, while punishing players for spamming the items. The meter was also shared with the new feature of this game, which was merging and walking along walls, which was incredibly unique and very well used throughout the game, whether it be for puzzles or even bosses. Now, how did people react to this game? Everybody loved it. Everybody. It was the first time since Ocarina of Time that every Zelda fan seemed to come together and express their love for the newest entry. Just so you know, it ended up selling more copies than Skyward Sword. You heard that right. The most recent 3D game on the latest home console was outsold by a game on a portable system with laughable presentation in comparison. It was easily the portable game that sold the highest in the series, and it is considered by plenty of people to be its best 2D entry. What helped a lot of the fanbase stick together for this one is that there was also a story present, featuring pretty much everything the fans could hope for. Further lore around the series as staples, interesting characters who are affected and change as a result of your actions, good writing, twists and turns, etc. While not being too important to the series' lore, the story was still interesting enough for the narrative enthusiasts out there. Couple that with very well implemented new gameplay features that didn't feel like cheap gimmicks to most players for once, a very solid lineup of dungeons, a world that still felt fresh to explore, helped a lot with its new wall merging mechanic, there were almost no complaints at all with this game. It really was the change people were hoping for back then, and their prayers were answered. This game is also another great entry point if you're interested in getting into Zelda. A Link Between Worlds really changed the series, to the point where, to me, it marks the end of the era of light and dark. We were finally entering a new era, which I will call the era of Hyrule's rebirth. In this era, we would see the series return to and embrace the roots of what gave birth to it in the first place: freedom and exploration. This philosophy was eventually pushed to new heights that go beyond anything the series had ever seen at this point with the following 3D title. We were also approaching the release of the new home system called the Nintendo Switch, which was the successor to the Wii U, which had replaced the Wii back in 2012. As it turns out, this Zelda game, which was originally planned as a Wii U title exclusively, would then be announced to be a launch title for their new system, basically like Twilight Princess was for the Wii and GameCube back then. The situation for the Switch was also very similar. Just like the GameCube, the Wii U had failed to meet sales expectations, and there's no denying that a Zelda game as a launch title helped the Wii tremendously. Would it be the same this time around for the Switch? Well, let me introduce you to a game that would change things forever. This was The Legend of Zelda.
Hey!
Wait, what?
Listen!
What do you mean I missed the game?
Look! Watch out! Hello?
Oh. Yeah. A main series title was indeed released in 2015 for the 3DS, and it was called The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes, and I bet even you forgot about that one. Yeah, this game, while not received terribly at launch, ended up being just a flavor of the month game. It was another multiplayer entry that nobody asked for who took some very questionable game design decisions. This time though, you were able to play online, which was definitely better for accessibility. While the multiplayer gameplay might have been the best out of the three when played with friends, it was a whole different story when played with random people. Anyone who's played anything online has experienced these problems too. They're not unique to Triforce Heroes. Idiots, trolls, infighting, you name it. I've personally seen pretty much all of them myself. Plus, the servers are shut down today, so you can't even play online anymore. This means you're stuck playing the worst part of the game, being single player. They really missed the ball with that one. I alluded to questionable design decisions earlier, and they're almost all related to this game mode. Imagine playing through a level, but instead of controlling every Link at once like in Four Swords Adventures, you had to make each of them move one at a time. This obviously won't get tedious at all through 8 worlds, right? Some stages and bosses were also clearly designed with only multiplayer in mind, and were therefore miserable to play in single player. Triforce Heroes ended up selling the second worst out of all the Zelda games, predictably so, but it did bring one notable point of evolution for the series, which was the many different outfits Link can wear giving different bonuses. This was technically not a new concept, as wearing different tunics started back in Ocarina of Time 17 years prior, but Triforce Heroes definitely pushed it further than any other game in the series by that point. It's something that would be present in each of the following games, so I think we need to give credit where credit is due here. That said, almost nobody cares about this game nowadays, which is understandable. You're still able to play with others via local play, but all you can do by yourself is play the, let's say, less than stellar single player. It at least was able to progress the series during the time it was relevant. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, the next 3D game. Like I was saying, it came on both the Wii U and the Switch in 2017. How did I describe it again? That it would change things forever? I feel like I should apologize for saying it like that because that is the biggest understatement anyone can ever make. Let me introduce you to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Since words cannot possibly describe how gigantic this game was, let me use numbers instead. Back on the Nintendo 64, Ocarina of Time, one of the greatest games of all time, sold around 7.6 million copies. Twilight Princess, which was the highest selling game in the franchise at that point, sold about 8.9 million copies on the GameCube and the Wii. Breath of the Wild, when combining both the Wii U and the Switch, sold 33.8 million copies. That is incomprehensible. That is insane. What I think helped sales the most is that the marketing campaign for it was excellent. The last trailer we got for it specifically, I think is the single greatest trailer in video games history. If you haven't seen it, you absolutely need to, it's glorious. This game impacted the entire world of gaming. It inspired many clones. Needless to say, people liked it. A lot. What happened exactly? A single trailer cannot possibly make that much of a difference, can it? Well, maybe? What happened is, it was the complete antithesis to Skyward Sword. There were only two things that were mandatory to finish the game, which were doing the tutorial area to have access to the rest of the world, named the Great Plateau, and defeating Ganon. That's it. Once you can get off the Great Plateau, you could head straight to the final boss and defeat it. You'd get absolutely destroyed if you tried, but it was something that you could do. This was unprecedented in the series. Even while thinking about it today, it just seems so crazy to me that it was something you could do. The world was also back to being completely open like it was in the very first game, and every dungeon could be completed in any order you wanted. That world, by the way, was gigantic. It was enormous, bigger than even the Great Sea from the Wind Waker. To explore its now completely open world, Link was able to climb pretty much any surface in the game. Coupling that with the paraglider that allowed you to glide, and more importantly, look around while doing it, it led to one of the most addicting gameplay loops. The paraglider in itself wasn't a completely new idea, as it is very similar to the Deku Leaf from the Wind Waker. It was a fan favorite item back then, but that game never pushed its use as far as Breath of the Wild did. The feeling of exploration, the environmental storytelling, and the tales you could create yourself in this world were just unmatched by any game that released at that point. Those two mechanics, climbing and gliding, just complemented each other so well to make any player want to see what was beyond every mountain they came across and power through every weather condition just to see what they could potentially find. They also both required stamina to perform, which was back to how it was in Skyward Sword, except with several boons this time. The biggest one being that it was permanently upgradable. To do this, you needed to acquire 4 spirit orbs in the world, which could be spent at one of the Hylia statues to increase your stamina bar. You could also use the same number of spirit orbs to upgrade your health as well, meaning that everyone had a choice on how they wanted to approach the game. You could try to play safe and have more health at the cost of playing slower, or go for a riskier but more action-oriented playstyle. The choice was yours. This also meant that heart pieces, which was the way you would upgrade your health in almost every game since A Link to the Past, had been replaced by these orbs. Each one was obtained by completing one of the 120 shrines that were spread all over the world. Those of course could be spotted from mountaintops or while gliding due to their flashy orange color, making exploration even more engaging. Shrines were small and condensed challenge rooms that, once finished, would grant one spirit orb. These, along with some other points of interest, also worked as warp points for you to come back to at any point, making for a very effective fast travel system. Items as we knew them were pretty much gone. With one very small exception, the only required abilities you get for the whole game were all found on the Great Plateau, the tutorial area. There were none inside dungeons. You would get really helpful bonus abilities by completing the dungeons, but nothing that was required for anything in the game. Link's iconic bow was still available as a weapon instead of an item, which was equipable like a sword or a shield. You could find plenty of these weapons everywhere throughout the game, either from enemies or treasures or just laying around, and there was a good reason for that. Every single one of them broke after a certain point. This meant that you were constantly trying to scavenge for resources early on, as the earlier and weaker weapons broke way more easily, making you play on survival mode the whole time, especially on the Great Plateau. At first, the number of weapons you could carry was fairly limited, but you could upgrade that quantity by returning Korok seeds to Hestu, which was a new collectible you could find by solving small puzzles hidden in the world. These were there to reward players for noticing that something they would see felt curiously off, like a misplaced rock in a small formation on the ground. There were 900 of those all over the map, which is an insane number, but you were clearly not meant to find all of them, as they were not all needed to get all of the upgrades. Beyond weapons and Korok seeds, you could also find a lot of different treasures, which range from collectibles, armor pieces, and the tried and true rupees, the currency Hyrule has been using in every game. Collectibles could be found by doing many different things. They could be out and ready to be collected, they could be gotten by breaking rocks, by defeating monsters, and so on. They could be sold at any point for rupees if you didn't need them, but could also be used to cook meals or to upgrade your different armor sets, which were also two brand new features. Cooking was used for healing off damage, as you would expect, but also to grant temporary effects like an increased damage or running speed or stamina meter, and many others. This was an evolution of the different potion types Link could use in the previous 3D game Skyward Sword. Armors were used to increase resistance to damage, again as you would expect, but they could grant a permanent bonus while wearing them. The most useful armor sets helped you resist the different weather conditions certain regions had, like the freezing cold, harsh sunlight, or burning heat. You really wanted to upgrade those armors because enemies did a lot more damage here than they did in previous entries. This was definitely a game where you died a lot early on if you were not careful. On the subject of armors, for the first time since the very beginning of the series, Link's official outfit in this game was not his tried and true green garb he's been wearing for 31 years up to this point, instead being a new blue tunic, probably inferring that this was a new beginning for the series by the developers. Needless to say, all of what I said so far was a pretty big departure from what the series was known for, and because of all of these changes, many people started calling the game Breath of Fresh Air as a joke. The ideas that started from A Link Between Worlds, like the required items being available from the start, the freedom of dungeon completion order, the open world, and more that were received so well on the 3DS title, had been pushed further than ever before. Further than even the original 1986 game. The new physics engine also made way to really express yourself in combat, giving a huge array of possibilities to approach the different combat scenarios. There are endless amounts of videos on YouTube demonstrating these possibilities, and some of them are really impressive. The story was also not as front and center as it had been in previous games, which made sense as it is much harder to have a story-focused game while having a completely open world at the same time. It definitely existed, and it had its interesting moments centered around Zelda's character growth, but it was back to being not the main focus like it had been for the last 15 years or so. That said, it was the first Zelda game to have voice acting in it, which was very welcomed. Breath of the Wild would also receive 2 DLCs during the following year. The first one mainly gave a new combat arena and a master mode for those who wanted extra challenges. The second one, and to me the better of the two by quite a lot, gave a bonus dungeon, extra shrines, and new story content to help flesh out the important characters even more. Those were pretty solid and well received DLCs overall by the players. There are more things I could mention about Breath of the Wild, but I think you get the point. Overall, this game wasn't huge just for Zelda. It elevated the franchise to being probably the most popular one in gaming at that point, and influenced the whole industry during the years following it. Just like Ocarina of Time was back in 1998, in the eyes of many, this game was also a contender for greatest game of all time. After Breath of the Wild, it would take 6 long years for the next Zelda game to come out. This was in part due to many delays, and of course the pandemic. Unfortunately, this meant that all of us kept playing Breath of the Wild during those 6 years, and over time, people started to notice and acknowledge the flaws of the game more and more, to the point of questioning the greatest of all time contention they used to believe in. The flaw that stood out the most to everyone was how pretty lackluster the dungeons were compared to previous games. Outside of Hyrule Castle, which is now a fan favorite, they all worked exactly the same. You had 5 terminals to activate somewhere in them, and they could be activated in any order. They were also a lot smaller and shorter than previous dungeons, had almost no enemies in them, and all shared more or less the same visual aesthetic. Excluding the final boss, which was just kinda terrible, the dungeon bosses also shared a similar problem. They were all a variation on a blight form of Ganon. Once you've seen one, you've kinda seen them all, and once you've read the names of the first 2, you could deduce those of the last 2. And yes, I said first 2 and last 2. This wasn't a mistake, for as big as the game world was, there were only 4 main quest dungeons, which was much lower than the average of 7 or so at this point in the series. There's not even one optional dungeon hidden in the world, and unless you count the Yiga hideout, there's not a single mini dungeon either. Even the most story-focused games in the series, like Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, despite what their haters could say about them, the quality of their dungeons was never brought up, as they both offered great ones. Majora's Mask, which also had 4 dungeons, had some very strong ones too, and had 2 mini dungeons as a bonus. One of the most important commandments of the series has always been and will always be, "Thou shalt not mess up the dungeons." You can screw up everything else, but this was the one exception. However, the game proposed an alternative. The idea was that instead of having bigger and longer dungeons like in previous games, the dungeon content was going to be spread across the previously mentioned 120 shrines in the game. This, unfortunately, did not really sit well with players. Having the dungeon content spread out like that meant that each shrine was going to feel significantly less memorable. Also, since there are so many of them, it would be a miracle if every single shrine was great. And yeah, some were, but definitely not all of them. Many were just empty, where you would simply walk to your reward with nothing stopping you. Those usually had some sort of overworld quest attached to them at least, but a couple of them were out in the open and didn't, or had a quest that didn't even need to be completed for you to find it. There were also a lot of combat shrines where the goal was to take down a single enemy. There were 21 of those including the tutorial one, which is about 17% of the total number of shrines. This all felt more like a quantity over quality approach from Nintendo, especially when you factor in all the Korok seeds present in the game. There might be 900, but there were about 10 different puzzle types hiding them, meaning a lot of recycled content. The weapons breaking was also something that seemed to get old for most people. It was a system that was very fun early on in a playthrough, but that lost its charm the more you progressed. When you find a powerful and cool looking weapon, naturally you're gonna want to save it, as you don't want to waste it because, well, it'll be closer to breaking. Because of this, in general, you're gonna end up avoiding combat, as after a certain point, there's no real reason to fight random enemies anymore. There are no unbreakable weapons at all in the game. Even the Master Sword, the most legendary weapon in the series, breaks after enough hits. It doesn't break permanently, it just has to recharge for a little while, but it's still very disappointing when you see it can break the first time. I think it can make sense based on story reasons, which I won't spoil in this video just in case, but it's still not ideal for gameplay. The enemy variety was also pretty low for a Zelda game, probably the lowest in the series. Most of the enemies you fight over and over are either bokoblins, moblins, or Lizalfos. The others are either roaming bosses, which also get repeated a lot, or bats that die in one hit. Finally, a less present story was naturally going to disappoint a portion of the fanbase, but this one might have gone too far in the opposite direction. This is a minor spoiler, but most of the actual story of the game has already happened, and you're experiencing it through memories you find here and there. Most people, even the ones who don't care that much about stories in games, would have still preferred to have experienced it in the game's present time instead of its past via flashbacks. The plot, while not necessarily bad, was also very bare bones compared to what we were used to by now. Link, who felt like his own character during the previous era, especially in the 3D and DS games, reverted back to his original idea of being a silent protagonist who doesn't emote very much. That said, you can say that it makes sense in a game like this with a lower emphasis on story. There were other minor things like the cooking system having its problems and the voice acting being, let's say, inconsistent, but those were the major ones people had. With all of that said, it seemed pretty obvious what Nintendo needed to do for the next game. If they could address the problems that I stated while also keeping the excellent feeling of exploration, it would no doubt be the greatest Zelda game ever made. At some point, the trailers for the next game began to roll. We learned that this next entry would be a sequel to Breath of the Wild featuring the same Link and Zelda, which was definitely not uncommon for the series to do. Zelda 2, Link's Awakening, and Majora's Mask were all direct sequels to their previous releases, featuring the same playable Link, and so was Phantom Hourglass to the Wind Waker. We also learned that it would reuse the same map as Breath of the Wild, which had mixed reactions. That said, A Link Between Worlds had reused the same map from A Link to the Past and made it work, so maybe they could do it again here. There was also going to be an added sky part to the original map, so we would at least have guaranteed new locations to explore. This also didn't seem to convince too many people at first. I'll speak for myself here, the sky is an area that somehow the Zelda series has never been able to truly make interesting at this point, despite their multiple attempts, so it definitely didn't sell me on the game. What really didn't seem to sit right though is that Nintendo told us that the game was born from ideas that were originally supposed to be DLC content for Breath of the Wild. The rumors that the new game was just going to be a glorified DLC was starting to brew among the fans. To make things even worse, it was announced that the game would cost $70 instead of the standard $60, which I'm in Canada so that was $90 here. Let's just say that it didn't seem worth it for just a DLC. We were a couple of weeks away from the release date and it didn't seem to look too good. However, every single doubter shut up completely when they laid their eyes on the very last trailer before release, which was just as good as the final Breath of the Wild trailer. This was what convinced all of us that this game was going to be amazing. It was that good. There were still people who were doubting the game, but now they were in the clear minority. With all of this hype, in March of 2023, the follow-up to Breath of the Wild would finally be released, and it was titled The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. When the game released, just like the previous entry, everybody loved it. Everybody was praising it, saying it was so much better than Breath of the Wild. A lot even said that there was no reason at all to even play Breath of the Wild anymore, as it was so much better in every way. Let's look at what was addressed from the complaints. The first thing is that now each dungeon had its own visual theme, and each dungeon boss was also different from one another, so that was nice. The map was indeed the same as the previous game, but now with added caves to explore that weren't there previously. There were new Sky Islands, which we knew about, but also a completely new location that was as big as the overworld map, hidden from us in every single promotion, called The Depths. The shock of discovering this place was an experience nobody can ever forget. Everything in there was in complete darkness, and it was up to you to find your way to the different light routes to light up the place bit by bit. On the combat side, there was a significant increase in enemy variety for both the regular enemies and bosses, which was very welcome. Also, compared to the previous game, there was a real reason to fight enemies. This was where the abilities of the game came in, and oh man, these were ridiculous. With those, you could fuse anything to anything. You could fuse whatever you felt like to your weapons, your arrows, your shields, or just stick two things out of the open together. There were also a bunch of different Zonai parts with various properties, like wheels, wings, fans, etc., to help you out with your creations. You could essentially make anything you wanted. A vehicle to help you travel more easily, a robot to help you fight enemies, anything you can think of, you can probably make it. There are so many insane creations people posted on YouTube, and it's crazy to see how innovative you can get with this. The monster parts you would get from killing enemies could now be fused onto your weapons to make them more powerful, and some of them can give damage buffs, but also various properties. For example, you can use your arrows with monster eyes to make them guaranteed to hit their target, which is so cool. It was pretty common for various collectibles in Breath of the Wild to stay in your inventory for the whole game and just rot there with no purpose, but Tears of the Kingdom gave you a reason to use them for something. This, along with some other new features, was very technically impressive. It's actually really hard to believe that these abilities work as well as they do. The game truly is a technological achievement. With all that said though, the honeymoon phase did not last for a lot of people. In fact, not too long after release, plenty of people started to express how they were disappointed with Tears of the Kingdom, and it is now, a year later, one of the most divisive games in the franchise. The biggest appeal to the game was no doubt the different fusing mechanics and how creative you could be with them. Even though it's really neat, and I think most people would acknowledge that it doesn't resonate with everyone. Not every single person is willing to spend over an hour to build a robot that will help you take on enemies that you could have just taken on yourself. It didn't really invite you to try stuff out that well. If you chose to engage with it as little as possible, what you were left with is just Breath of the Wild, but again. The game structure, the main quest, the upgrades, the progression, the way you fight, all of it was exactly the same. You start on the tutorial area, this time named the Great Sky Island, where you get all of your abilities for the whole game. After that, the world opens up and you can do the 4 main dungeons in any order you want, and can even head straight to the final boss if you feel like it. There are new main quest elements to the game once these dungeons are done, but the general structure is still 90% the same. The way you upgraded your gear was also the same, Koroks were back, now totaling a ridiculous 1,000, shrines were also back, and there were 32 more this time, and just like last time, not all of them were masterpieces. Even the way the story was told was exactly the same, via memories, which worked fine for Breath of the Wild as the story was more about the characters than the plot, but Tears of the Kingdom's story was the opposite. It was a pretty in-depth story that was much better seen in a linear fashion than in fragments like this. As you might have guessed from this, most of that story again had already happened in the past, and you didn't get to experience any of it yourself. The plot of the game also had several problems. The general ideas weren't necessarily bad on their own, in fact, they were really interesting, but they were executed pretty poorly. I won't go into too many details, but let's just say it required a lot of characters to be really dumb for everything to happen like it did. Also, for a game having a lot more emphasis on story than its predecessor, having Link still be as emotionless through everything like he was in Breath of the Wild just felt worse here. I know a lot of other Zelda YouTubers have complained about the lack of consistency with the series' lore, but this is something that only time can really tell if it'll be a problem with future releases. There are things though, like missing elements from Breath of the Wild that definitely didn't make any sense, and will never make any sense even with time. The official explanation we got from Nintendo about those was also just yikes. Weapons were still breakable, and this meant all of the problems with that system carried over to this game. Fusing stuff to your weapons did make them last longer though, but the base duration of weapons was also lowered compared to Breath of the Wild, so it didn't make that big of a difference. The dungeons, while having their own visual theme now, still had the same terminal system from Breath of the Wild. The ability to create a vehicle in them with the different fusing abilities can also cheese a lot of their puzzles, some definitely more than others, but plenty of their intended solutions can just be ignored entirely. This was even truer for the shrines, where some of them could be broken beyond comprehension. While freedom to tackle challenges in your own way was something that was embraced at different points in the series, this was the concept pushed to its extreme, and for some players, it felt like too much of a good thing. There is kind of a strange dichotomy about freedom in video games. While it can be nice to have all the freedom in the world, the reality is that most players will inevitably gravitate towards a dominant strategy. The most efficient strategy is what most people will employ in almost any situation, even if it's the most boring one. This is best exemplified by what people dubbed the hover bike. This vehicle is extremely simple to make, costs almost no resources, and is able to do pretty much everything you would need a vehicle for. The sooner you figure it out, the less you're going to use anything else. Finally, while we did have new areas to explore with the sky and the depths, they were both really bare bones. The depths in particular was a second map, but had very little value in it. There were some points of interest, but it felt way too big for what it really offered. When it comes to the sky, the tutorial island was pretty much the only interesting place. There were very few truly unique locations up there, and a lot of what you will come across is copy-pasted everywhere. It seemed more like an excuse to have more shrines and Korok seeds than anything else, which calls back to this idea of quantity over quality that arose from Breath of the Wild. It was clearly doubled down on. All in all, very few of the complaints from Breath of the Wild were addressed in Tears of the Kingdom, and the ideas that defined this era of Zelda games seemed like they were pushed to their extremes. Despite everything that was said, the game still ended up selling really well, close to 21 million copies, which is still more than double the numbers of Twilight Princess. The reality is, there are plenty of people who absolutely loved this game. There are still really great moments in Tears of the Kingdom, and if being creative with the new abilities is something you find enjoyable, this is your dream game. Despite the problems people might have had with it, I don't think anyone can seriously say that it was bad. What was probably the most frustrating thing about Tears of the Kingdom for most people is that it took 6 years to make, and it didn't really feel like we got a new game in some aspects. Obviously, the pandemic happened, which clearly slowed down the production, and I can understand that it had to be really hard to pull off a lot of what was in there, but 6 years still felt really long for what we got. When it comes to how Tears of the Kingdom evolved the series, we're going to have to wait and see if the new features will have any impact because, as of today, it is the most recent Zelda game, and with that, we have arrived at the end of this retrospective. Since a lot of information was said in this video, let's recap what the different eras were and what characterized them. The first era was the era of chaos, and was a time where the series was trying to find its roots and tested stuff out to see what would stick. The second era was the era of prosperity, where the blueprint of a Zelda game was finally put together, and where we witnessed several gameplay innovations while staying true to the series' roots. The third era was the era of light and dark, where we would see a shift away from these roots in favor of telling more compelling narratives. The fourth era, which is the latest one at the time of this video, is the era of Hyrule's Rebirth, where we would see a return to what started the series, which would be pushed further than ever before. The question now is, what can we expect from the series' future? Well, a new Zelda game is about to come out a couple of days after this video is released, which is The Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom for the Nintendo Switch. We still don't have that much information on it outside of 2 trailers, but from what we did see, it's looking like the era of Hyrule's Rebirth is still going strong. The emphasis still seems to be on freedom above all else, but probably not as much as the previous entry though. What I think is more interesting to think about is where the series will go after Echoes of Wisdom. Several people have now expressed their desire to see a more traditional style of Zelda again, which, when people say that, they usually mean going back to a more restrictive and linear one. The series' producer Eiji Aonuma responded to these feelings in an interview he did a couple of months back, saying that he doesn't really understand why people have that desire. I'm going to paraphrase here, but he essentially said that he didn't see the appeal of a game where you were more limited in your options, as opposed to one that lets you do more or less whatever you want. This is something that I personally don't agree with. Despite the numerous positives ultimate freedom can bring, and I do think there are plenty, I also think it's easy to recognize the advantages a more restrictive game can bring, being more challenging and varied puzzles, better overall level or dungeon design, and the possibility to tell a more engaging story. This is something that the series used to do really well during the second and third eras that was kinda lost in transition starting with the fourth. I do have a hunch that Aonuma secretly agrees with this, since the locations where most of the puzzle content is found in the latest 2 games, being the shrines, take away some of your options when you are inside them. Why would they ever take the time to program these restrictions if they didn't see why freedom could be a problem at times? Doesn't it seem a bit contradicting? However, even though I don't necessarily agree with Aonuma, I still understand where he's coming from. Freedom Zelda, as I'll call it, is the most successful the series has ever been by a long shot. Tears of the Kingdom didn't reach the insane sales numbers of Breath of the Wild, but it still sold close to 21 million copies. Ever since the openness of A Link Between Worlds was praised 11 years ago, the series only got more popular. It would seem crazy to get rid of it after only 2 games and go back to a moment in time where the series was struggling the most. I don't think I'd want to go back either if I was in his shoes. He probably believes that these opinions are coming from a loud minority of people, and based on the sales numbers, this is probably the case, or at least it seems to be the most likely scenario to him. One thing is sure though, and it's that Nintendo does listen to the feedback from the fanbase. They have demonstrated that they do so more than once by now. Also, on a more positive note, Nintendo doesn't seem to be running out of original ideas, as the Echoes mechanic from the upcoming game is something really creative. Ultimately, I think it's safe to say that we can trust Nintendo with the future of the series based on everything we've seen. I think it's likely that we will see another major shift in the series' design very soon, and probably on the Switch's successor, whatever it ends up being. I'm predicting it for the game directly after Echoes of Wisdom, and here's why. The second and third eras have both lasted for 11 years. If you count it, we've been into this fourth era also for 11 years already. It doesn't seem like it since there have been only 4 and soon 5 games released in that period compared to 7 during the previous 2, but it has in fact been 11 years. After looking at all of these games one by one though, I think it's so impressive what Nintendo has managed to achieve with this one series. From the mid-1980s to now the mid-2020s, Nintendo kept trying new ideas over and over, and while not all of them paid off, the willingness to try and explore is something that needs to be praised and applauded. I mean, wasn't it the idea that started the whole thing? Exploration? It's really amazing to see that after all this time, after all these years, no matter how this series keeps evolving, Zelda will keep the idea of exploration alive and well. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you've made it through all the way to the end, you have no idea how grateful I am. If you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate if you hit the like button, and I'd appreciate it even more if you subscribe to the channel. I'm also really curious to know which one of these eras is your favorite. Which one is your least favorite? I would also love to know what you guys think is the future of Zelda. Where do you think the series is going or should be going to? Do you think we're about to see another major shift soon, or do you think this fourth era will keep going for now? Do you think Nintendo will eventually start giving us more linear games again? Give me your thoughts in the comments. I will read it. And thanks everyone for watching. See you next time, guys.